Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Cracking Addiction. My name's Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and once again, we have with us Mr. Stephen Hurd, who's an expert in family violence. Hello, Stephen, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Fergal. Glad to be here again.
Thank you for coming back. So, further to our last chat, I thought we'd explore, this idea of the definition of family violence, which is all about control. And, there's various ways of looking at the control within a relationship. Tell us about your method of looking at control.
Well, I guess one of the standard tools that's been around for a long time, it's called the power and control wheel. So if you can picture a bicycle wheel, it's got a tyre, it's got a rim, it's got spokes, and it's got this central hub. And looking at the spokes, let's say if we can divide that up into 8 sort of sections, if there are 8 spokes there, there'd be 8 wedges. Each of those can represent a type of behaviour. The types of labels are things like using children in family violence settings, using financial control, emotional control, male privilege is one of them, using intimidation, and a range of others. On the outside of the wheel, are probably the two major types of physical violence that can be used. Physical violence per se and sexual violence, and they sit on the outside. And right bang in the middle is the purpose of the violence. The purpose of the violence is control, to have control over the other. And it's interesting to know how this wheel came about too. In the town of Duluth in Minnesota in the late 80s, when this particular agency was really interested in exploring what male family violence was. They interviewed hundreds of women about their experiences. And what occurred to them is that these 8 themes came out as to their experiences. Very similar. Even though there were hundreds and hundreds of women who didn't know each other, spread all over the place, their recollection or their descriptions of the violence that they experienced was really similar, really similar, and fell into a range of categories. But they all felt this sense of being controlled, and if they didn't comply with these violent behaviours within the wheel, the intimidation or the threats or the male privilege, then they'll be subject to physical or sexual violence. So that threat was already always there. So that the rim of the wheel is always there if they don't comply to that particular type of violence, the emotional violence or psychological violence. So that's a really interesting model.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the experience is so universal that we are able to come up with a limited number of themes, aren't we?
Well, that's right. And that's it used to come as a surprise to me. I sat once in on a training session with people from America, people from England, people from Australia, and the patterns of behaviour were the same. Patterns of behaviour used by male perpetrators seem to be the same, coming from the same playbook. And then the experience of women seemed to be the same. And so that really speaks to,
So, we think about the definition of family violence really as predicated on control and coercion between a man and a woman in a familial setting or in a relationship. But we do need to acknowledge that that's not necessarily the experience for all, and we do need to acknowledge the existence of other types of relationships and other types of familial settings. But it's interesting that you say male privilege. So, tell me, what do you think of when you hear that phrase, male privilege? What is male privilege?
Male privilege. Well, it is bestowed on men. I guess the observations are over the centuries, over the millennia, men have been in charge.
Yeah.
In charge of the judicial systems, the policing systems, political systems. What happens at home? And so men have been in charge of all these services. And it's not a stretch to say that the vast majority of decision-making roles are taken up by men in our societies, even still. And that was a feature of the growth of feminism through the 60s and 70s, and still is a push for feminism, which really says, well, let's be a bit more equal. And what it's given us men, though, Fergal, you and me, is this idea of privilege. And what privilege means is unearned advantage. Now, we've got an advantage that we didn't earn. We've just been given it. We were born this way, and we feel, well, this is our normal. Thank you very much. It's my normal to be the educated one in the family. And my sister, well, she doesn't have to go to uni because a man will marry her and she'll be looked after. Whereas me as the man, the young lad who's going to uni, supported by his parents, supported because I'll have to raise a family and support them. But then I get the privilege of education because of that. And I've never really would never have questioned it. I get the privilege of, when I come home, to put my feet up on the table and not have to get dinner or whatever, or that kind of stuff, because I've earned the money. I've flogged myself all day working. That model may not be strictly true now, but the essence of it is to some extent. But that's what was challenged through the whole feminism years of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and continues on. And so our sense of privilege means we've got this certain power that we've been given, and when that power gets challenged, we get a bit upset, we get a bit threatened. So our privilege wants us to equalise our power, and even equality. And I got reminded by this quote the other day, that even trying to become equal is threatening around our privilege. It feels like we're being oppressed. So,
something strikes me when I'm listening to what you're saying there, that a woman once said that we're frightened of men because we're afraid they're going to kill us. Whereas men are frightened of women because men are afraid that women are going to laugh at us. And even there's an inherently unequal, there's an unequal relationship in terms of the potential for threat. It's interesting also. I mean, you've described in this wheel, you've described various types of control. I mean, now let's talk about financial control. That feeds into this idea of male privilege. If I'm the breadwinner, I'm allowed to control what happens with the money. I'm allowed to use that as a weapon. Talk to us about that. How does that manifest in your work?
It's about accountability a lot of the time. I've got access to my money, so I spend it on what I wanted. I then give a portion of that to my wife to run the house, X amount of money for the house. And somehow she's supposed to manage all the food, all the bills, all the kids' needs, all their own needs out of this allocation. And if it runs out, then what the hell's been going on? She's got this money, but it's run out. It's also, I would want to have a look at all the receipts. Go through all the bank accounts. It's pretty easy now. I'll just go through the bank accounts and see where it was all spent and how much was spent.
Yeah.
And so I'm providing the money. I'm also being the adjudicator of whether it's worthy to spend money on these items. Whereas the same scrutiny is not held for me.
Yes, exactly. The same scrutiny. I mean, because I'm hearing you and I'm thinking, well, I give my monthly paycheck to the missus. She manages the finances. But
this brings a really interesting point too. This is the next is how much negotiation went on to do that. Because it could work perfectly in a lot of relationships because that's what's negotiated.
Yeah.
That's what's expected. That's how it works. And if there's more money to be needed, well, it might get asked for and then given and dealt with. But it's negotiated. A lot of the time, the rules aren't clear or the rules change.
Let's talk about psychological control. You mentioned that in the wheel.
I guess there's. I've come across it a lot in various settings now. But a word called gaslighting. So I've struggled over the last sort of 12 months trying to come to terms with this phrase gaslighting, as opposed to psychological abuse or making the other person feel crazy, that the reality is not what they think it is. That, no, I'm not having an affair.
Well, I'm not having an affair. No, I'm not gambling. No, I'm basically any activity that I'm trying to hide, I'm not doing it. It's usually uh, yeah, when confronted with the evidence, it's not true. Usually it's about, I think usually it's about money and sex, basically. Those are the key drivers for men, wouldn't you say?
A lot of arguments about finances, uh, uh, especially when the man might have lost his job, um, and uh,
Hmm.
and so his finances are really cut, and they're under stress. So the stress is not having money is a good trigger for anger, good trigger for violence, um, and and the argument with the partner might be that she inadvertently spent money on re-registering the car, for instance, and his plan that that's not what was going to happen. Um,
Mm.
so the argument is, even though they need a car and all that kind of stuff, she's taken the decision to re-register it. Whereas his argument would be, we're having financial issues, we can't spend the money on the car for these
Mm.
reasons. But then it's just not an argument. It would probably get physical. It would probably get to the point of throwing stuff, punching a hole in the
Mm.
wall, storming off, slamming the door, and meanwhile having the kids hear all of that. So it's the whole nature of the argument. But the essence of the frustration for the man is not about the money per se, but she's made a decision about something and he didn't have the final say
Mm.
on it.
But that's not necessarily gaslighting, is it?
No, that's not gaslighting. No, that's
No.
financial abuse or decision making around finances.
For me, it's all about denying the evidence of infidelity or inappropriate financial spending. I don't know why I picked those two things, but I've always thought that that's what it, that's the for me it's that's the commonest context. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up there for today's episode. I'd love to explore how the hubs or the spokes of the wheel then lead to the periphery, and so hopefully what I'd like you to do is to agree to come back and join us again. We'll explore this topic further.
Love to be further.
Okay, that's all for today's Cracking Addiction. See you soon.